Okay.
That was not my voice.
Okay, so hello everyone. It's really nice to see you all again. I have a few announcements before we actually start with Paula's talk. So first of all, I'm joining the Palgrave Studies in Pragmatics, Language and Cognition as a series editor. So if you want to give us a book, you can contact me or Richard Bruhini. We'd be very happy about that. So especially after our discussion in the last meeting about the future of experimental pragmatics, it became apparent that there are some overlapping themes such as interactive paradigms, production, methodological issues. So we'd be very happy if you contacted us with a book proposal. And also Glossa Psycholinguistics is accepting submissions now, and they actually recruited several members of our community as part of the editorial team. So for example, Petra is an associate editor and Florian Schwarz, and I'm also part of the editorial board. So this is another great outlet, I think, for our community now. And as for, one other thing I wanted to say, so Ira's book is available at an affordable price now in softcover. And so this was the last advertisement. And so today we're very happy to have Paula Rubio-Fernandez to give a talk. And as always, we ask you to put your questions in the chat first. You can either, we can either read them for you, or you can ask them yourself in person. And we will again prioritize junior researchers, so PhD students and early postdocs in the Q&A session. And I'll hand it over to Ira now.
Thank you, Nicole. So I am introducing Paula. We were just trying to figure out, I asked her, trying to remember when was the first time we met. And it was back when she was probably a student at Cambridge.
Yeah.
So I think that conference must have been 2003.
Yeah.
And then my first thought, before we started talking today, my first thought was like, Paula must be the most well-traveled experimental pragmatist around, because she's been not just at Cambridge, but she's been at UCL. She did a postdoc at Princeton with Sam Glucksberg. She has a relationship with MIT, which brings you there too, right? And she's now based in Oslo, where she has she's attracted many grants. I was going through your list of grants, and I want to embarrass you with how much money you've brought in, but you've done well for Oslo.
But it's never enough. It always runs out. I'm still looking for one that renews itself.
Yeah, and lately she's been working on, joining simile and metaphor and scalars, and so it's a real experimental pragmatic project. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Paula.
Okay, thank you, Ira, and thank you, Nicole. Let me share screen again. Okay, does this work? Let me see. No. Okay, we tested it before, I assure you. Let me just close this one.
It did actually work.
It worked. It worked. So I think, let me start afresh. This should work, right? Let me see. Yeah, here we are. Okay, so yes, today I'm going to tell you, since we are all getting nostalgic going back in time, part of my PhD thesis in Cambridge with Richard Bruhini was looking at metaphor and other concepts. And at the time, I wasn't one of the trendy ones in XPrag looking at scalar implicatures, because that was the hot topic at the time, at the beginning. But I'm coming to it via, the figurative language route. I'm gonna explain you how today. And so I'm going to present you with an old puzzle. And a solution that we provided, we being Bargers, Chris Cummins, and myself in 2017, is a paper where we're bringing together two literatures from experimental pragmatics. And then I'm going to report two recent studies, one that has just come out with kids, the other is under review. So I very much welcome your feedback. So the old puzzle is that you may notice that a hare is similar to a rabbit. And you can indeed say a hare is like a rabbit. That's felicitous. What you cannot say, or not so felicitously, is that a hare is a rabbit, because it's not. Now, the puzzle is that this is what happens when you try to turn a literal comparison into a literal categorization statement. Things get weird. But there's nothing weird when you do that in figurative terms. I can tell you that Wilma is like a princess, but I can also tell you that Wilma is a princess. That's a metaphor. So whereas the hare and the rabbit, we were looking at a literal comparison or a literal categorization statement, here is a simile and a metaphor, and those are interchangeable, unlike the literal counterparts. And this is the old puzzle I was referring to when I emailed Nicole. It starts back in the Aristotelian view. One way to solve the puzzle is to see metaphors as implicit similes. So the idea is that Wilma is a princess and Wilma is like a princess are effectively communicating the same message. It's only that in the case of the simile, it's a direct open comparison, and the other is an implicit comparison, but both are comparison statements, more or less direct. The alternative, the categorization view, was espoused by relevance theory, Sam Glucksberg and Boas Kaiser as well, among a number of people. And in this view, metaphors and similes are understood differently. Metaphors are categorization statements, and similes are assertions of similitude. So here, the idea is that when I tell you that Wilma is a princess, I'm classifying Wilma as a special type of princess, an ad hoc concept. We used to call it princess star. And under princess star, it's not only Wilma and real princesses, but only those who behave in the stereotypical, say, posh or snobbish sort of way. Perhaps under princess star, you don't even find real princesses who are not, princess-like or royal-like in the stereotypical sense. And that's different from when I compare Wilma to a real princess. When I say Wilma is like a princess, there's no new concept there, nothing, it's no, what you need to figure out is how she's similar to a real type of princess. And this is the account, since I mentioned that I was working on figurative language for my PhD, this is the account that I was investigating, but it's not what I'm going to tell you about today. Today, I'm going to be looking at the relationship between categorization and comparison statements. And this is something that has come up. It's not the main topic of all these references, but it comes up in these papers. And I've chosen a clear quote from Kaiser saying that category membership is incompatible with assertions of similarity. For example, if copper is a metal is acceptable, then copper is like a metal is not acceptable. Similarly, if one asserts and believes that someone is an actual baby, then one cannot simultaneously assume that this person is like a baby, right? So there's some incompatibility there. And this was our starting point in 2017, where we looked, I think this was the first study I ran on MTurk. We were looking at comparisons to a superordinate. An apple is an apple like a fruit. And we agreed with Kaiser and everyone else, basically, that there's something pragmatically odd about saying copper is like a metal. But we didn't go the route of being incompatible. It's either categorization or comparison. We argued that copper is like a metal is under-informative. That's why it is pragmatically infelicitous. Copper is not merely similar to a metal, it is a metal, right? So it falls short of being true if you take the pragmatic enriched meaning. And that's what we were arguing. And the solution, comes by bringing two XPrag literatures together, the scalar implicature literature and the figurative language. So as all of you know, if I were to tell you that Wilma ate some of the drumsticks, you'll be entitled in normal circumstances to infer that Wilma didn't eat all of the drumsticks, because if that had been the case, that's what I should have said. And we applied the same type of reasoning between comparisons and categorization statement. So if I were to tell you that Wilma is like a fashion designer, you would be entitled to assume that she's not a real fashion designer, because if she was, I would have told you so, assuming I knew her profession, right? So we run the usual diagnostics. I'm not sure if this comes from Larry's work, but I'm illustrating here one of the examples we used in the paper. Betty might tell Wilma, your engagement ring is like a diamond. And Wilma would be allowed to respond, it's not like a diamond, it is a diamond, right? So this is the part, the type of uses you can afford when you're using scalar expressions, right? So the idea is that categorizations are the weaker counterpart of comparisons. Comparisons are stronger. It's similar to the point of class inclusion, right? Anything less is just similarity to some degree. So today I'm going, as I mentioned, I'm going to tell you about two studies. The first one is a developmental study. Now, those of you working in this area, you know that most of the work on simile interpretation has compared interpretation of similes with metaphors, and it seems that children find similes easier. The idea is, I think the general assumption is that because this comparison, this assumed to be implicit comparison, is clearer in the simile, children have less problems with John is like a bulldozer than John is a bulldozer, or any child-friendly metaphor. Perhaps that's not one of them. But rather than comparing simile with metaphor for the sake of with the goal of looking at figurative language, we looked at the derivation of scalar implicatures. What we call the X is not a Y. That if I tell you that Wilma is like a fashion designer, I may be implying in certain contexts that she's not a real fashion designer. So in the first experiment, we run the task with preschoolers, 3 to 5, first graders at 6, and the controls were 13-year-olds in middle school. And we run the task in 2 blocks. In the first block, we presented the kids with categorization statements, like Lucy is a parrot. And in the second block, with comparisons or similes, Lucy is like a parrot. And the reason why we blocked the items was because we know that one of the things that make figurative language more accessible to small kids is the derivation of scalar implicatures is to make the 2 alternatives more salient. So we wanted to make it clear that we were using a second type of expression in the second half. And I can already tell you that that didn't quite work as we expected, but that's for later. So we called it the metaphor condition, because if I were to tell you Lucy is a parrot, the pragmatic interpretation would be that Lucy is this girl here who looks like the parrot, right? The literal one would be that this bird is called Lucy. It's a literal statement. And this is not really a test of metaphor comprehension. It's completely out of context. The most we could expect was to see whether children appreciated the ambiguity, right? Lucy is a parrot could refer figuratively to this girl or literally to the bird. And we wanted to see if out of context kids showed a preference or appreciated, as I said, the ambiguity. You can see here that from preschool to first grade, everybody showed a clear preference for the bird, for the literal interpretation. They took Lucy is a parrot to be a literal categorization statement. Whereas the kids in middle school, the 13-year-olds, were at chance. And I remember administering I run the task as a class exercise. And I remember them talking about it, like, but is it a bird with a girl's name or a girl that looks, so I think that they were aware of it out loud when I was collecting the exercises. So again, this is not to offend anybody. This is not to say that 3-year-old or even 6-year-old cannot derive metaphorical meanings. It's only that at least they have a preference for the literal in the absence of context. And what happens in the second half of the task? What happens when we start presenting them with Lucy is like a parrot? And here we see a different picture. The 3-year-olds still prefer significantly above chance the bird, the literal interpretation. The 4-year-olds are at chance, and it's only 5 and 6 that show a preference for the girl that looks like a bird. Okay. Now, the reason why I said that the block design didn't quite work is that, of course, at this point, we wonder if these kids, and maybe even the 4-year-olds, if there could have been some sort of persistence. They spend the first block being very keen on selecting the literal response, the animal, right? Rather than the child that looked like the animal. They were all cartoons like this. But rather than considering the kid, they kept choosing the animal. It could just be that there's a lack of executive control to change tag and change response. And the 3-year-olds maybe just continue selecting the animal, and the 4-year-olds were a chance. So that's one option we consider. But then there was a sweet anecdote, and I want to tell you because it actually conditioned really how the experiment progressed. One of the 3-year-olds was, I mean, those of you who've tested kids, sometimes you have the feeling that these are, very old people caught in a very small body. And I remember this 3-year-old, right, very talkative and very, very know-how. And of course, he had also, when presented with Lucy's like a parrot, he had also selected the bird. So, at the briefing, I couldn't help but ask him, but, you said that Lucy was the bird here, but you don't think this is a bird? Pointing at the animal. A parrot. You don't think this is a parrot? And he said, no. Oh, really? What do you think it is? That's a drawing. And I thought, wait a minute, we have a Magritte in the house. Maybe these kids are taking the similarity between a drawing and a real animal, right? Which is, again, something that, as at least me as a grown-up, I hadn't considered. And so, taking these guys' wisdom into account, we ran experiment 2, where half the kids were again presented with the drawings. Now, here we did not use the categorizations or the metaphor categorization items, not to prime the literal response. We wanted to have the whole task, use the same materials, but in the simile, in the comparison format. But we ran half the kids with pictures. That took some thinking, because at some point I remember trying to look for pictures of children who look like animals, but that felt very, very wrong. So I went for face painting, which was much safer and easier to get IRB approval. So half the kids got the same items in the drawing condition, the others pictures like this. And this is what we found. In the drawing condition, you can see the kids generally perform better. The 3-year-olds that were before above chance, with a clear preference for the literal interpretation for the animal, they were now preferring them, or they were a chance between the two. By the way, I've just realized I didn't tell you the type of task I used. That's not good. This is a traditional, I run the task in Spain, where we have this game, veo veo, I see literally is I see, which I believe is I spy with my little eye in English. The idea is that you're looking at something and you give the kid a clue, and they have to guess by giving the clue what you're looking at or what you have in mind. So that was the idea. Lucy is like a parrot, apologies, was a clue for, what of these, which of these 3 characters do I have in mind or I'm looking at. And here you can see the 3-year-olds were now a chance between the animal and the girl who looked like the animal, which suggests that having the metaphors in the first block was really hurting us, was really, driving them towards the literal interpretation. The 4-year-olds went from being a chance in the previous experiment to now being below chance, like the 5-year-olds. So they really showed a significant preference for the girl who looked like a parrot. So they're getting it. Now, in the photograph condition, things work actually better. So it is possible that the younger kids were taking the like to be, or at least some of them, referring to a similarity between a drawing and a real animal. Here, all participants, of course the adults, were significantly below chance. It was a reliable preference for the girl who was painted like a panda. That's, a very early derivation of scalar implicatures starting at 3, and the 5-year-olds were also at the same level as the adults. There was no difference there. So they're really, it seems that they really get it. And you may wonder, well, are we sure that they are deriving scalar implicature? Perhaps they're not. And so we run a post-test, which is now experiment 1 in the paper because a reviewer asked for it and you have to play ball, but it was a post-test. Because I wanted to see what happens if you ask the kids, present them with the same photos, but you ask them, is this animal like a panda? Yes or no? Is this girl like a panda? What about this girl? Is she like a panda? And what we observed is that all kids from 3 to 6 were at ceiling in this task. Everybody agreed that this guy here was like a panda, she was like a panda, she was not like a panda. So if you agree that these 2 guys are like a panda, if when kids the same age are then presented with a clue, Sonia is like a panda, if they're not a chance, to me this suggests that they're doing something different, right? They are enriching the meaning of is like a panda to is like a panda, but is not a real panda, is only similar to a panda, right? So it's on those grounds that we were arguing that this is early derivation. And you may wonder why so early? Our hunch, I don't know, we've got Eve in the room, so she can probably tell us more about this, but we wonder whether our guess was that both categorizations and comparisons are probably very frequent in child-directed speech. In fact, comparisons, there are longitudinal studies showing that they start to freely, spontaneously produce comparisons like Sonia is like a panda at age 2.2, 2 years, 2 months, so very early. So we think that it might be that getting the non-Y implicature, X is like a Y means X is not a real Y, that may develop earlier than, you know, other scales like sum and all and other quantifiers. So that was, we argued in the paper, we think it might have to do with early exposure. So the conclusion is that we can see that children already in the first year of preschool can show a preference for the pragmatically enriched meaning of a simile. Lucy is like a parrot, but is not a parrot. Supporting the view that children's documented difficulties with scalar implicatures need not result from their limited pragmatics, but rather from the protected acquisition of alternative expressions and their scalarity. And we think that comparisons and categorizations, or in figurative language, similes and metaphors, are good candidates for early acquisition. So moving now to study 2, the bridge here is actually the post-test. I told you that kids as young as 3 agreed that this animal is like a panda. This, if you think about it, runs counter to all the experts' intuitions about how copper is like a metal is wrong or should not be used. 3-year-olds are very happy with it. So are 3, 4, 5, 6-year-olds. And we found that adults are very happy to agree that this one is like a tiger. In fact, we didn't find a difference between items where the bubble said this one is a tiger versus this one is like a tiger. So whereas, again, we appreciate that this one is like a tiger is under informative or, not ideal, suboptimal, people still verified it to the same extent that they verified this one is a tiger. So that was the starting point for the second experiment. This is with adults. And what you see here is all the papers that have looked at sum and all, right? The golden standard, until Bob Van Til and others came to show that sum and all, far from being the canonical case, are a bit of an outlier. But you can see here, these are true responses, right? So some mosquitoes are insects. The true responses varies quite a bit of variation, but it's certainly there are fewer logical responses than in the case of a piano is like an instrument. This is the 2017 paper I was referring. People were almost at silly and accepting a piano is like an instrument, or the picture I showed you, this one is like a tiger. In fact, our results were more similar to those papers that tested sum and all with literal or pragmatic instructions. So participants were either told to focus on the literal meaning or the pragmatic meaning, and our results were comparable with those participants who were asked to respond according to the literal interpretation. So we wondered why is this, and we were not alone, as I said, there's recent work on scalar diversity showing that the rates of false or pragmatic responses that have been observed with some and all are not generalizable to all types of scalars. So it's not weird, if you like, that people agree to a piano is like an instrument, more so than they agreed to some mosquitoes are insects. But still, we wanted to look into this. And so the first thing we did was to run a rating task. We just put into, this was prolific. We tested items like some mosquitoes are insects versus all mosquitoes. And a piano is like an instrument versus a piano is an instrument. And asked people to rate on a 1 to 7 scale how good or bad these descriptions were. And we see the usual pattern. Strong items get higher ratings than weak items. But interestingly, and as we expected really, some mosquitoes are insects was rated lower than a piano is like an instrument, right? So both weak statements are less preferred than the fully informative ones. But somehow some mosquitoes are insects sounds worse. And we can discuss, I'll be look forward to hearing why people that think that might be. My hunch is that the scale between some and all is much more, it's more lexicalized, it's more grammaticalized than between comparisons and categorizations. But what we wanted to see was whether by mixing these types of statements, weak and strong, but of different families, we could get people to respond pragmatically to the comparisons, to say that a piano is like an instrument is bad or false, right? And we were following recent work by Louis and Alice Rees, trying to prime pragmatic reasoning. And here, well, Louis is in the house, so I will let him explain his own design. But the idea is that they use prime trials, where it was the two alternative readings were made very clear. So you have to choose the card that better represents some of the letters are B. So you're given this choice between the two alternatives, and then you have a target trial where you can, hedge your bets on this or go for the better picture. And the idea is that making the two alternatives salient primes you towards deriving the pragmatically rich interpretation of the target item. And importantly, because this is something we didn't do, this type of design pairs the prime trial and the target trial. They are consecutive. What we did was much more messier than that. We just took some items from Ira's work and intermixed items like all mosquitoes are insects, some mosquitoes are insects, with the comparisons and the categorizations. They're all comparisons to superordinate, by the way. So they are, pragmatically speaking, they're false. And we just built a task that randomized this individually. So it's not really a pairing of an item that makes the alternatives very salient and see how that affects your next response. This is just a mix. What difference does it make to have some and all items in a sentence verification task? They had to say true or false, or a sentence evaluation task. We run both online, true, false, good, bad. And I'm showing you here responses to the strong and the weak critical items. And you can see that there are higher true good responses for categorizations than for comparison. So a piano is an instrument is preferred. But the key difference here is that the responses to the comparison, to the weaker term, are affected by whether or not you introduce some and all items in the mix, right? When there are some and all items intermixed in the task, they respond pragmatically. They say false or bad more frequently than when it's just categorization and comparison statements alone. And we replicated an old pattern, going back to Ira's work, that false or bad responses, both for some statements, but also for under informative comparisons, they took longer than true good responses. And the way this pattern has been understood is that deriving the scalar implicature, the implicature that if you say a piano is like an instrument, you're implying that it's not an instrument, therefore is false. That reasoning delays the response. And we observe that with the comparison statements. So what happened here, right? So what happens when you mix some and all items with your categorization and your statements? As I mentioned, Rees and Bott used a type of design that highlights the two alternatives to a scalar expression. And we're not, as I said, we didn't pair items. We did not highlight the alternatives in any way. The way we interpret this, it starts with an old paper by Sam, where they were looking at semantic memory. There's a big literature around 1918, looking at, you remember Eleanor Roche findings, that if you have to verify a robin is a bird, you normally do it faster than a penguin is a bird. But you also falsify a fish is a mammal more slowly than you falsify a shoe is a mammal. And Sam and his PhD student, they proposed this model where the process by which you verify or falsify these statements is by aligning the properties that are associated with the concepts. So your concept bird is associated with the properties of the physical, the physical properties of a typical bird, right? The size, color, song, whatever your average bird is. And robin shares more, at least with the American participants they were testing, shares more of those features than a penguin does. And therefore, the fact that there are more properties in common facilitates your reaching a yes, true response. Whereas the reverse applies with a fish is a mammal. Fish and mammal have more nodes in common, if you think of a semantic network. And therefore, falsifying it, reaching a negative response takes longer than shoe is a mammal, where there's not so much in common. Now, I think that when you have to verify items such as a piano is an instrument or a piano is like an instrument, you do the same property alignment process. You're establishing the similarity, going back to the beginning of the talk, between piano and instrument, and you reach a yes response. This would explain why people were happy to verify both statements, the categorization and the comparison. And what I think happens, or what we think happens, is that when you introduce some and all, there is what we call an informativity bias. Some and all are much more, as the ratings suggest, and probably all the other experiments showing much more frequent pragmatic responses. The scale they form is more strongly lexicalized, grammaticalized, if you like, and so they strike you as false more readily. You're more readily struck by some elephants have trunks as being odd than a piano is like an instrument, which if you're doing property alignment, you're perfectly happy to say yes. However, when you mix the piano cases with the elephants, then you start appreciating the informativity or the under-informativity of a piano is like an instrument. So somehow what changes is the verification procedure. What happens is that you have an informativity bias, whereas rather than checking the overlap between piano and instrument and any other item you're comparing, what you're doing is establishing whether it's optimally informative or under informative, in line with what happens, I don't know how automatically, but more readily with the all and some cases. And so the conclusion is that introducing some and all statements in sentence verification and sentence evaluation tasks introduces an informativity bias, such as the verification or evaluation procedure changes from one of property alignment between the two concepts, here it would be piano and instrument, to one of optimal informativity, right? The degree to which the sentence is appropriate in terms of informativity. And so that would render a piano is like an instrument false. Now, I would be very interested to hear your thoughts on what type of, priming happened here. In Rees and Bott, as I mentioned more than once already, they were pairing prime trials with target trials and trying to highlight the salience of the two alternative interpretations. We didn't do that here. We simply mixed some and all. We are exploiting, of course, the scalar diversity. We are exploiting the fact that some and all are, invite a pragmatic reading, more so that under informative comparisons, more so than other type of scalar expressions. But what is your hunch? What is your interpretation? What could be happening when you're verifying these less than ideal comparisons, like copper is like a metal, and you only notice, or perhaps some participants only notice, that there was something weird with those statements when we introduced some and all, right? So again, we are still under review, so it's really the time to get your feedback. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paula.
You're welcome, Nicole. Let me see you.
Yeah, many interesting, thought-provoking findings, I think. I have a number of comments and questions, but so we don't have anything in the chat yet. Maybe I'll ask something then.
Okay.
So about the first experiment, so maybe one reason why children are better at these cases is that they don't actually have to access some lexical alternatives. So I think your cases are very different from the usual sum and all cases, right?
Mm-hmm.
So on one hand, you don't have this unmentioned alternative that you actually have to access.
Yeah.
And then also what's being asserted is more complex. So I'm wondering if you've considered the possibility that this is more like an I or R implicature, where the complex expression denotes the less stereotypical instance.
Yeah. Yes, I think that could be the case. And another thing that I'm very much aware is that it's not so much in Spanish, so that wouldn't explain the developmental responses. But in English with like is heavily polysemous, right? So you also adding to the complexity of the fact that you're looking at a structure, not at a lexical scale, right? You're not looking at some and all or warm and hot. Here is a whole structure. You have the polysemy on top of that. I'm looking now at the arrow data, because in Spanish, es como is not polysemous in the same way. Although we can use como for hedges, and there's some constructions, but it's worse in English. So I think that yes, the fact that it's a construction and that it's polysemous, I think that it could make affect the pragmatic reasoning. Yeah, I think so.
So we have questions from Larry and Lewis.
Yeah, I enjoyed the presentation a lot. I think, I mean, in my terms, I think the relationship between a piano is like an instrument and a piano is an instrument is both Q-based and R-based, because it is a more complex construction, but it's also informationally weaker.
Yeah.
And so it's a typical case, just like P or Q versus P. You have two reasons for preferring P to P or Q. But historically, actually, it's quite interesting that the very first example that Grice gave of quantity or scalar type implicature, as they come to be called, was this looks pink to me, in his paper on the causal theory of perception in 1961. The relationship between this looks pink to me and, as he put it, there is some reason to doubt or deny that it is pink. In other words, you wouldn't say it looks pink unless it isn't pink, or unless somebody thought that it wasn't pink.
Nice.
And so even though that's not quite a simile, it's very close in obvious respects. So my question had to do with something that you just brought up after your talk, which is the polysemy. And I think that it's natural. I think children will be exposed to the discourse particle like. And so if we were to say something like, this one is like a tiger, as opposed to this one is like a tiger, yeah, I think it would be very unnatural to stress like, which would disambiguate it away from the discourse particle and towards the relevant one of the simile. But if you take that to be a discourse particle at all, or if you're wondering whether it's a discourse particle, then of course what the child will do is just disregard the function of like for the purposes of truth conditions and process that as the piano is an instrument, or this one is a tiger or whatever, and disregard the like. And by using, by interspersing Ira's some and all type sentences, as you say, that reduces the likelihood that they're going to treat the like as a discourse particle, or the enterprise as being about about just subject predicate sentences, and instead take it to be about underinformativity. And so you get the right kind of prediction there.
Yeah,
so that was
I would like to call F, if she wouldn't mind, because I know she's got some very interesting data on prosody and children with like, right? If it's like a zebra. I remember the study with this like
a zebra.
Looks like a zebra.
The prosodies on, it's a very in focus.
Yeah.
Actually, the study was not quite that. It was where you show children pictures and say, it looks like a zebra, but. And so you have this special intonation contour, and even 2-year-olds are extremely attentive to that when they are learning how to label instances of different categories.
Right.
But this is a very stable form of feedback that parents seem to give from a very young age. And it's
Is that my mother? It looks like my mother, but
exactly.
Nice, that's nice. Okay, so it seems it makes sense. I was worried it was going to seem to, I don't know, strange that it would have that, you know, that some and all would have that effect. But my hunch is that it really changes the task. It changes what they're doing. I mean, I would be curious to look at that type of paradigm during the task, right? So what happens if in the first half of the task you have only categorizations and comparisons, and you introduce some and all in the second half? You know, is there some change in behavior that we could, if it clicks, if there's something that makes you realize, wait a minute, this is not great. A piano is not just like an instrument. Is there a eureka moment in the second? Would there be a eureka moment in the second half of the task? So again, I'm not clear we could tap into that moment, but I do have the feeling that you're doing something else. You're looking at the task differently. That's my hunch, but I look forward to other people's ideas.
There's one other thing I think you might want to think about, that in English, generics at least may occur with no quantifier on them. So you could say mosquitoes are insects, and that simply assumes that holds for all the members of the category. And so the introduction of some and all makes it seem slightly odd that you're somehow pointing out a property that does apply to all of them versus a property that doesn't apply to all of them. It seems to me that that's departing a lot from the kind of generic information you expect with categorization.
Yes. Nice. So it's a big call. Okay.
Although generics, I think children learn pretty early on that generics don't necessarily entail universality or homogeneity. So they get things like lions are fierce, but they can, you know, accept that there are lions in zoos who are tamed or whatever.
Louis, you had a question?
Yeah, so it was about your explanation for the introduction of some and all in the last task. So you said that the task changed from property alignment to one of judging informativity. surely property alignment happens in both of these tasks. I mean, you can't not do property alignment. So, you know, it's not one of changing the task. It's about adding an informativity question. You know, to evaluate the statements, you have to do the property alignment, because presumably you have you know, you have statements like pianos are mammals or something.
Yes.
In which case, you know, it doesn't matter what the quantifier is.
Yes.
It's going to be wrong. So, you know, your final slide, I think you put up, it's not so much of a change. You're adding something else.
Okay. Well, the task is always verification or evaluation. You're always saying true or false or good or bad. So that you know is loose talk on my part. But the idea, and perhaps I didn't stress this properly, in Sam's model, in the McCloskey and Glucksberg, the idea is that there's a certain threshold that you reach in the similarity between piano and instrument. And you reach that threshold faster with piano than with flute, or, you know, less typical, the same with Robin and the penguin, right? All the Roche findings. So the idea is that the more typical an instance, when it comes to categorizations to a superordinate, the faster you're going to reach that threshold that allows you to agree, yes, this is a member of the kind. So the idea is that if, without the sum and all cases, if what you're measuring is the degree of similarity between pianos and instruments, or mosquitoes and insects, or whatever you are judging, what changes is that I think the informativity of the whole sentence, at some point I wondered even, and again, this didn't make it into the paper, that I even wondered if they even process the difference between is an instrument and is like an instrument, right? So if you're only looking at the nouns, right, they may not have even, you know, for if you think of the big deal that is being made around metal, copper is like a metal being in Felicitas, and I'm telling you, it comes up again and again in the figurative literature, figurative language literature. It's surprising that they're happy to agree with that just as fast. The artists are comparable with a piano is an instrument and a piano is like an instrument. So I even wondered if they may be so focused on, you know, evaluated these two nouns that they don't check the copula, anyway. So I wondered if by introducing sum and all, you're looking at the statement as a full expression rather than just evaluating. You see what I mean? So this is.
I mean, I certainly think that the sum and all is changing the way that the sentence is being processed, and you know, it's perhaps.
You think it's one extra layer?
Yeah, but I basically think that you're doing property alignment in both of the conditions.
Okay.
And it's a question of, in one, you're adding a layer of informativity.
Okay.
In the other, you're not.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, my other question on this was kind of why, or what do you think would happen if you had a prime target pair task? So I've actually done the kind of sum and all version.
Yes.
If you actually prime with all, so prime all elephants and mammals, and then they get kind of some lions and mammals, then you know they're much quicker to reject that underinformative sentence next.
Yes.
You can do it all within subject.
Yeah.
Then it kind of stops any task demands or kind of strategic ideas about it, because within the same subject, you can get them to oscillate between saying yes to some elephants and mammals or no elephants and mammals.
No. That's fine.
And you know, if you can do that with your task, then you're starting to say that the informativity bias is actually kind of useful in a conversation, because you know you're switching very quickly to situations where you need it and when you don't need it.
Yes. Yeah. That's nice. And now I'm getting greedier, because then I would like to see what happens So as I said, I was thinking of a first half of the task where you just get comparisons and categorizations, then you introduce and see, you know, if there's any magical point where maybe individually see if they change the type of responses they're giving. But then what you're saying, I should also include a tighter second half where they're actually paired, where some of the participants do get not just a mix, but a prime, you know, prior trial, where the two alternatives are being, and perhaps the effect is even stronger, or you see it earlier.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, it was just
if you pair them
with the entirely within subject version. We're not talking about blocking it at all.
Yes.
You can just get people. You should be able to get people to swap between accepting the under-informative statements and rejecting them, depending on what the prime was.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Nice. Okay. So a lot to follow up on. Thank you, Luis.
So Herb had a question next.
Hi, Paula. This is interesting stuff. I wanted to add to the complexity here a bit and take on the word like. And let's see if Larry likes my account of like here. The word like is actually underspecified pragmatically for what respects it's like. So like is really a three-place predicate. It's A is like B with respect C or R, let's call it R. So I can say, for example, my brother is like a chaise longue in length, or my dog is like this ham over here in weight. Now, so whenever you say it without any respect indicated, you're being asked pragmatically to infer what is the respect that's being implied, entailed, implicated, whatever your theory about all of this stuff is, for that particular case. And so when you say a piano is like an instrument, now you're saying, oh my gosh, what kind of instrument is he thinking of, and what way is it supposed to be, in what respect is it supposed to be like that? Notice that if you say a piano is like a musical instrument, boy, is that hard compared to it's like an instrument. And now, you know, there are lots of instruments and you're thinking, gee, maybe I have got to get this, the right categorization here. I go back with this idea way back to some old work by Amos Tversky on China is like North Korea versus North Korea is like China. Now, the way you want, he had a particular account of this that I think is not very useful here. But you had to infer, well, in what respect is China like North Korea? Well, it's in one respect, but when you say North Korea is like China, then you're thinking of a different respect. And so he found that these are two, you know, you like one statement better than the other, but it's because of the respects that you're thinking of. And you can move this all over the place pragmatically. In your bare statements, I would like to know what respect are they really think, and is this complicating things? So when I think of, gee, my dog is like, you know, Fido is like a dog, I'm thinking, oh my God, what respect is she really asking about? So anyway, is an addition. I don't know what it does to your experiments, frankly, but it is a problem.
Yeah. There are cases that are clearer than the instrument. So I appreciate that there are many types of instruments, but you know, think of items like a banana is like a fruit, or an apple is like a fruit. Those should be even weirder than the piano instrument. So you think that?
You know, I could say copper is like a metal in most respects.
Yeah, perfect.
And then that makes perfect sense. That is, I can do that. And it could be that that's what you have to think. You have to think, oh my gosh, in the paradigmatic respects, or in most respects, or in all respects. And in some ways you say, if you're saying copper is like a metal, but you're now thinking now of the prototypical metal, and yes, it is. Whereas you could say uranium is like a metal, and I would have to think of good examples here anyway.
But do you think, Herb, do you think that thinking of the priming, now Louis got me, about the priming cases, it would be possible to have certain items that make you think in a certain way about fruits or instruments, or that could sway your interpretation of the critical item as true or false, right? So that perhaps a banana is like a fruit becomes less under informative or less odd if it's in a context where somehow there are degrees of fruitness. I don't know, you think it could be normalized, something that generally
No, I have no idea. What you mean by prime, of course, means...
Or contextualize.
Contextualize, yes. So what are we doing in this experiment? And then you're asking, gee, what am I supposed to take most things as the prototypical case? Or am I supposed to think about them in other ways too? And I think some of your stuff has that character to it.
Okay. I hadn't thought, I mean, I've been thinking about the R parameter that you referred to from, working on metaphor. So the metaphor ground, right? The famous metaphor ground. On which grounds are you claiming that, Mary is a princess or Judith is a swan? What aspects of the swan are you attributing to Judith? And of course, that applies to all the comparisons. It could apply to all the comparisons in our items. I just hadn't thought of that as a type of context.
There's an old, I don't know about an old paper, there's a paper by Dedry, Gentner, and a couple of other people on respect. So I don't know how that would help you or not.
Okay. But I think that could sway interpretation, definitely. You could normalize something that out of context seems like copper is like a metal, that seems odd or under informative. If you're talking, in a different context, you could probably make it okay.
So we have 3 more questions. So Michael Israel was next.
Hi, thank you. That was a really interesting talk. What I sort of missed was how your data was actually figurative. It seemed like most of your examples were literal comparisons and literal category statements. And I'm just wondering if you're really going to find the same kinds of inferences when you go from clearly figurative similes to clearly figurative metaphors. And I was just trying to look at examples. When I and my co-authors worked on a paper on simile, which you actually cited, we were discussing the word similitious that we were thinking of using, and Vera Tobin said, similitious is like a party in your mouth. And so that strikes me as very clearly figurative in a way that most of your examples didn't. And it also, part of the point of this is we noticed that particularly with equative similes, we posited that there was something we called the superlative source constraint. So that if you say it's as, as slippery as an eel, then eels must be taken as very slippery. And if you it's more obvious with something like as cool as a cucumber, where cucumbers do not normally have a reputation as being especially cold things, but the simile clearly means he's very cool. And so if that's the case, if similes tend to mark a sort of extreme instantiation of whatever the target property is, then it seems like you wouldn't get the difference in, you wouldn't get the pragmatic inference, the Q inference, to not the strongest. And so so I guess, my simplest question is like, why did you think you were talking about simile and metaphor when I didn't? And have you thought about like how that might change?
Yeah, so I think that because my starting point is relevance theory, I don't make classification of language being literal or figurative. You know, it's all to a degree. And in this case, we had the challenge of, so the idea is that with metaphors and similes, you're comparing or classifying things that are not alike. So to say that John is like a bulldozer or John is like his brother, the distance between John and a bulldozer and John and his brother in terms of comparison is obvious, right? That one is much closer. You could make it even more remote than a bulldozer. I'm sure that there are weirder things one could say about John. So the idea is that it's not, and this is something we say directly in the paper, is difficult, is easy to find canonical cases of metaphors and literal categorizations, similes, literal comparisons, but it's not always easy to classify all instances because of this degree, right? So what we wanted was to use, because we were testing small kids, we wanted to base the comparison on properties that were visually perceptible, right? So if someone is like a bulldozer in a meeting and doesn't let other people talk or interrupts, or that doesn't map directly visually to the behavior of a bulldozer. I mean, maybe it does for us adults, but I'm not sure a 3-year-old would understand, right? That interrupting other people or being obnoxious is a way of being a bulldozer. So we were trying to think of, you know, similarity between the people, the kids that we were showing, and animals, which are different types of things, but are, you know, definitely more similar. Now, it's a physical similarity between the nose of the girl and the beak of the parrot. So I grant you that that is, you know, much more, I don't know, concrete, if you like. The similarity is visual, is much easier to detect than properly abstract things like, you know, examples like Judith is like a swan. In what way? Does she have a long leg? Does she move graciously? It could be so many. Is she very pale? I don't know. I could imagine, you know, many ways in which you could be like a swan. That is not as simple as this, you know, curvy nose, but we were trying to simplify the task. And as for figurative language, I'm not sure there is so much hanging on it, whether they took them as literal comparisons or figurative, because what we were interested was the fact that they did not, that when they started to show a preference or considering the girl who looked like a bird and not the bird, right? So we were interested in the shift from one preference to the other between the categorization and the comparison. So, you know, I appreciate that maybe it's not metaphorical enough. My answer is that we try to make them accessible to 3-year-olds.
No, that's fine. And I mean, I found the paper really interesting, and I found the result that you get the scalar implicature from the comparison to the not literal statement. But my big point here is that similes do seem to have this property of being superlative, which is just not true of literal comparisons, right? So if you say John is as tall as Bob,
I see.
If you say John is as tall as
I see.
then you're taking a horse as a tall thing. And I mean, and I think it's sort of hard. I don't know. This predicts that, you know, John is as tall as a puppy is just going to sound weird.
Weird. Yes. I see. And I remember, it's coming back to me. You know, I remember Sam had in his work on metaphor, the idea is that this ad hoc concept, it was a prototypical instance of, like what you're saying, right? You're tall as a skyscraper, not tall as a teddy. So the idea is that you had to be, you know, perfect exemplar of whatever you're trying to predicate of Mary or John or whoever you're talking about, and you go for the exemplar. Yes.
That's also why I mentioned cool as a cucumber, because outside that expression, cucumbers are not cool, and so that's sort of part of my evidence that the superlativity comes from the fact that you're using a figurative comparison.
Happy as a clam.
Oh, that's another good one.
Which was originally happy as a clam at high tide when they couldn't be caught, but nobody knows that.
Bothers with the tide anymore. And you think that if we had been able to come up with items like that for kids, that it would have affected their responses? It would have made it harder?
I'm sort of asking a different question. My objection here is, like, what can I learn about scalar properties of simile from this kind of work. And I see all the problems with testing similes on young children. So I'm not, it's hardly a complaint. It's more, it's a complaint about the framing, I guess.
Okay. No, but then I need to think about that.
I think it's time we move on to the two remaining questions. Who was next? It was
Chris. It was Chris Cummins.
Chris, right?
Oh, thanks. I mean, I'm not sure my question hasn't already been answered one way or another, but I'm not sure that it has. So let me ask it anyway. It really is about whether there is any kind of extra relevance to looks like being available as an alternative to is like, particularly with those materials.
Yeah.
So we've talked to because people have brought up the question of, I think Herb was talking about the idea that is like is kind of implicitly picking out comparison, and is like in appearance seems to be maybe privileged because there's an easy way of expressing that. But also in the sort of face paint examples, I thought my intuition is that I couldn't really say, Ellie is like a panda about this. I could say Ellie looks like a panda, and I'm probably okay with saying Ellie is a panda, by which I mean something like she represents or denotes or is playing the part of the panda.
Yeah.
But I just wondered whether, there was something kind of developing along those lines of being aware of this alternative, even though it's not sort of not strong. It's in a slightly old place.
I didn't look at that, but we mentioned it in the paper because one of the reviewers pointed out, and rightly so, that looks like is often used in the theory of mind literature. The difference between a diamond and something that looks like a diamond is that it's a fake, right? So true essence versus fakes. And I think that that's something that kids this age would definitely. So it could be perhaps, Chris, that it actually helps that constructions like looks like signaling that it's a fake helps, the derivation of the non-Y inference. In instances like, where you don't say look like, but is like.
Yeah, it could make sense. I wondered whether it might take a little while to adjust to the idea that is like is supposed to mean.
It's being used.
It's being used in that way, yeah.
Well, thinking in Spanish, the thing is that es como is like and looks like, that's parece. It's a completely different verb.
Yes.
So,
could you say está como in the case of somebody who presently looks like a panda because their face has just been painted to look like one that doesn't normally resemble a panda?
Está como un panda. But está, to me, it would suggest that you have something much more temporary than your looks. It would be something almost action-based, those funny semantics. But yes, but I think that type of construction probably helps kids to understand the non-Y, right? Either looks or is like. Yeah, it's a very good point. Thank you, Chris.
And then Richard, another follow-up. Where's Richard? There he is.
Hi, hello. Sorry, I thought I was going to have a hello. Hi, Paula. I missed the beginning of your talk.
Don't worry.
But I reviewed the earlier paper you did on this RPP. So I know the early work, and I missed the stuff about kids. So I actually, but no, I thought Michael was going to ask about similes and how your account applies. But then you got into equative similes. And I suppose the comment on that is, I'm not sure it has a scalar implicature. So, I mean, if you say, this is like a fruit, you imply it's not a fruit. But if you say it's as tall as or as X as something, is there a scalar implicature there? The question. So I mean, maybe the as ones aren't going to fall. You're not going to be able to say much about those with the scalar account.
Well, if you say that he's as tall as a giant or as a skyscraper, I think there is a clear implication that he's not one, or else.
But isn't that a different kettle of fish?
It could be.
It's hyperbole or something like that, right?
It could be.
But just as a sort of, but I thought Mike was going to ask about the like case, and so like, what's the difference between the John is like a bulldozer and John is a bulldozer. He's the chairman of the meeting, right? Mm-hmm. And people say there's a difference between them. And I always thought that your account may be able to tell a story about that, to do with the fact that if you draw attention to the fact that he's not a bulldozer, as well as being like one, you're looking at more than a sort of only a figurative meaning. Right? So the figurative meaning is the ways in which he's like a bulldozer, but then the implicature makes you also pay attention to the ways in which he's not. So you get more this sort of literal sense of bulldozer in the simile case, and the pure figurative sense in the
It's also he's a regular bulldozer, where regular kind of turns it into one of those. Right? That's if he's a regular bulldozer, then he isn't an actual one.
That's nice. That's nice. So you've got the intended meaning highlights the similarity, and the non-Y inference highlights the difference. So the
so if you just say he's a bulldozer, and you're doing kind of property attribution, you access and you just find relevant properties, and he sort of pushes through the agenda, but somehow or other saying he's like a bulldozer makes you like look for ways in which he's not.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yes. Yeah.
It's making it.
Nice. So it's more nuanced.
There's a discussion of the intuition that the simile form is a little bit more literal like. It sort of makes you it keeps you closer to the literal meaning, than the figurative form.
Yeah. And Michael can probably attest to this, but I think that the idea that this difference between the strength of metaphors and similes, I think that that's something that also comes up quite a bit in the literature. The force, the perceived force of the statement. So that's nice. Okay, cool.
Just following up on that, the question that comes to mind is if you take something like similitious is like a party in your mouth versus similitious is a party in your mouth, which one suggests more that, so then you could ask people, so how fun is it to say similitious and have them rated on a scale? My prediction is that there's not going to be a substantial difference.
But if there is a difference, Michael, it'll go in the direction that you predict. It's not always going to be the case, but in as far as you're deriving any kind of scalar inference, and you're not always doing that, but if you ever do, then that's dragging you towards non-figurative properties.
Maybe. One would have to do it to know what the.
That's right. Yeah. In fact, there's some work by Gendner and one of her collaborators, where she does the comparison between between metaphor form and simile form.
Yeah.
Which sort of supports this idea, but it definitely needs to be looked at in more detail for sure. And I don't think it has been, but I've heard people say, oh, similes are different because you think more about the literal when you hear the simile than the, but not always. Obviously, that's a lovely example you have, and that's not going to be a case where that happens. So, I don't know.
Yeah, perhaps in our paper we argued that there's a lot of cases where you can have a figurative or a literal comparison. So we talked about comparing a woman to a flower. You could say she's like a flower because she's a biological entity, or she has cells, or there's a lot of literal ways that a woman really is like a flower. Without those specifications, so you're probably going to go for a figurative interpretation where she has, some lovely smell and a lovely appearance and is very colorful and, or whatever. Less central biological properties of flowers and more culturally associative properties. And so it's really not clear to me at all that the relevance theory claim that similes are just sort of farther on a scale.
I'm not defending that at all. I was just pointing out that if you're deriving a scalar implicature with is like a form, then however you're deriving the figurative meanings, whichever way you like, you're still going to be paying attention to the fact that they're not
one of X.
Yeah.
So like it puts a limit to how much you can be compared to an X somehow.
Yeah.
And that could be grounding it into more literal meaning.
Yeah.
Talking very abstract here.
Okay, so we're already over time, but so you could actually, I think we could close the meeting now, but you could stay here if you want to keep like chatting. But so for now, let's thank Paula again for this great talk.
Thank you very much.
And for the
very nice. Thank
discussion. You. And next month, we have a neuropragmatics talk coming up. So we're going to visit Einat Chitrit in Israel. So that's going to be very interesting too, I think. So we're looking forward to seeing you again next month.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm gonna stay a bit, Paula. So I wanted to say about the priming data. So I have some unpublished data with Stephen Crane and David Barner, where we tested children like intermixing different kinds of scalars, and we find a huge priming effect. So if you test all and some in a between subject design, then they don't derive the scalar implicature. But if you add an ad hoc trial with OR, where they also derive the implicature in a between subject design, then in the within subject design, 80% of the children also get the scalar implicature. Yeah.
Nice.
So I was still recording, Ira. So